Hey AP Psych students, this is Mrs. Sewell doing a quick review on Unit 1A, Scientific Foundations for a test on Monday. Remember the test will be 30 questions, 10 multiple choice questions on each standard. This time it's going to be on paper. And so let's start with our standard one, which is being able to compare structuralism and functionalism. It's important to know the people and the idea, the concepts, and the weaknesses, and be familiar with the salt metaphor. There's definitely a question on that. So let's start with structuralism. That's the very first school of psychology. It's created by Wilhelm Wundt. Remember, he's the father of psychology. So if it asks a father of psychology question, he's your man. And also very important that he created the first lab for psychology. He's trying to make psychology a science. His student Titchener coined the phrase, sorry, I got briefly interrupted. So Titchener's Wundt's student, and he coins the term structuralism. So he's doing the same work and he just puts a name to it. He may or may not be on the test. Okay, the idea of structuralism is to break down consciousness. You remember they're trying to explain behavior based on our consciousness, trying to break it down into its component parts or elements, like creating a periodic chart. And so they created a series of experiments. They trained people in introspection. Introspection's always on the test, always on your exam. And that is just, looking inward, examining your thoughts, your feelings, emotions, memories, reactions, those kind of things. So they would do things like throw a ball against the wall and then measure the reaction time. So those are important. Weaknesses of structuralism, that's usually on the test. Why did they stop using it? It's just not scientific. It's too subjective. People don't always tell you what they're really thinking, or they filter it, or it's not accurate. So it just didn't work. Remember the salt metaphor as well. I think there's a question on the test about that. If a structuralist, it's just trying to teach you how structuralism is like salt. So in salt, a structuralist would break salt down into its elements, trying to find out what makes up salt. So you got sodium and chloride, okay? So they're trying to do that, okay? Then you've got functionalism. William James is really important. He was the first one to write a psychology textbook. You don't even have to remember the name of the book. You just have to remember that he is the one that writes the first psychology textbook that usually pops up on the test or exam. Remember also, he's really influenced by Darwin. So he doesn't think that structuralism works. He doesn't think that the parts of consciousness matter. He thinks that the function of consciousness is what matters. And he ties in those evolutionary principles of Darwin. How does consciousness help us adapt, survive, and thrive? He created the term stream of consciousness. And so you use this actually in English, and that is just, the flow of thoughts and feelings. If someone writes in stream of consciousness, they just, whatever comes to mind, okay? Weaknesses of functionalism, it just was too vague. Again, it's not scientific. You can't really measure it. With the salt metaphor, functionalism is going to look at the functions of salt. They don't care about the sodium and the chloride and all that. They just care, what's the salt do? How does it help us adapt and survive and thrive? Well, you can use salt to cure meat, so to preserve it. And it also makes food taste better, so that helps us adapt, survive, and thrive. So those are the basics of structuralism and functionalism. If you know that, you should be solid on this test. All right, know the definition of psychology. It drives Miss Mailer and I crazy when you don't. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Know that definition. It's always on the test. It's always on the psych exam. And you would be surprised how many students miss it. That's why you're here. We're studying behavior and mental processes, and we're going to make it as scientific as possible. Don't miss that question. All right, your modern approaches. Really work on your keyword. This is a great little slide for you. All right, if it's psychoanalytic or psychodynamic, that's Freud. About that, got interrupted again. So psychoanalytic, look for words unconscious, childhood, repress. It's going to be about your past. Anything about their past that's interfering with their behavior, that's going to be psychoanalytic. Biological, also biomedical, it's neuroscience. Anything to do with genes, Okay, hormones, brain chemistry, disease. They're going to look at the medical causes of the behavior, and then try and fix it with surgery, drugs, whatever it takes. Cognitive, when you see cognitive, you want to always think thinking. Cognitive psychology involves, if it's about thoughts, memory, language, problem solving, creativity, then that's going to be cognitive psychology. Evolutionary psychology, if it talks about Darwin or natural selection or adaptations, got to remember genetics go with biological, so don't get that confused. Survival of the fittest, anything that sounds evolutionary is evolutionary. I mean, there's not that much to say about it. Just remember that genetics are biological. Seriously, that's a question. Okay, then behavioral, that is going to be Watson and Skinner. So if it talks about little Albert, remember that was Watson, where you trained the child to be scared of white rats. Anything about learning, behavioral, it's learned in your environment. So conditioning, if it talks about rewards, punishments, reinforcements, incentives, any of those things, that's going to be behavioral. Humanistic, Maslow and Rogers are the only two guys. Anything about the self is going to be humanistic. If it's talking about your growth or your potential or realizing your potential or self-actualization, if it's concerned with your needs, that is going to be humanistic. If it talks about the hierarchy of needs, that's all Maslow. And then you've got sociocultural, that's anything to do with race, gender, social norms, socioeconomics or income levels, religion, your political views, those kind of things. That's going to be sociocultural. You can see I'm trying to get this done before next period. All right, last thing, standard 3 subfields of psychology. You got to know the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. Psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They went to medical school and they can write prescriptions. That's the huge difference. Psychologists don't go to medical school. They get a bachelor's degree, maybe a master's, and maybe a doctorate. They are not a doctor of medicine. Okay. Then you got to know clinical psychologist versus counseling psychologist. A clinical psychologist will deal with really serious mental illnesses. So, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, emotional disorders, behavioral disorders, could be eating disorders, those kind of things. That's going to be dealt with a clinical psychologist. Counselors are going to be like therapists, and they're going to deal with more everyday issues and life transitional issues. So, if you're having problems in your marriage, you might get marriage counseling. If, you're having problems within your family, maybe a divorce or a new step parent, and there's some adjustment issues, they're going to help with that adjustment. If you've lost someone, they could help you with grief counseling. If you're making a transition in your life, like I'm making a transition as an empty nester, if I found myself, maybe depressed and not knowing what to do that with myself, since I don't have kids at home, then maybe I could go to a counselor and, get help with that. Then the last thing on, this versus that, basic research versus applied. Remember that basic research is just contributing to the general knowledge base. So, we're just interested in something. We want to find out the answer. That's going to be basic research. And remember the example we used, that they did a study on whether smiling makes you feel happier. Okay, that's general research. Applied research, oftentimes they take the basic research and they're looking for a solution. So if we know that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin, we've done some basic research and determined that, then applied researchers will actually, look for a way to increase your serotonin levels so it eases your depression. So that's making an application, finding a solution, trying to solve a problem. So that is the major things you're going to see. Then know your subfields. Know developmental, womb to the tomb. Okay, they're looking at age groups. Okay, it could be infants, could be elderly, could be teens, and they're studying people over their lifespan. Industrial organizational, always on that. They're trying to make the workplace better. It's going to be from an employer perspective. So as an individual employee, if I'm not getting along with my coworkers, that's not IO. Industrial organizational is going to come from the employer. How can we make the lines run faster in our factories? How can we increase worker satisfaction so they come to work every day? That's an IO kind of issue. Positive psychology, it's the newest branch, very much a humanistic and a cognitive approach. It's all about trying to make us live happier and more fulfilling lives. So it's trying to find your happiness. Psychometric psychologists, this is psychologists that measure things, okay? So they're creating personality tests, IQ tests, those kinds of psychological testing, and then maybe creating the cutoffs. They're interpreting the data. So they're the numbers people in psychology. Cognitive psychology, again, it's just like the cognitive perspective. They're just working on, your thought processes, okay? So if you have fears or irrational thoughts, memory issues, you're having trouble problem solving, problems with learning potentially, those kind of things, that's going to be cognitive psychologists. And then your forensic psychologists, they are anything related to law or criminality. So if it's about, trying to do a criminal profile, jury consultants, trying to work on defenses for the mentally ill, those kind of things. That's going to be your forensic psychologist. On the psychology types of psychology, the subfields, those are just different jobs in psychology. Know your vocab. Make sure you practice that standard 3 vocab. I've hit the highlights for you. These are the ones that are most asked, but it could be the others. But if you attended class and you did your reading and you did well on the quiz, you should do well on these subfields as well. Okay, you can do great on this test. Just study, practice that vocab, and you should be ready to go. If you have any questions after having gone through this, my students email me, Miss Mailer's students email her. If you have questions, we're here to help you. Good luck on your test.